Hello everyone. Welcome to this presentation about the paper on agenda setting with political satire. Very happy to be talking to you. So for this paper it's important that you understand the concept of agenda setting. It's a very classical theory within the field of political communication and communication science more generally, and basically this line is most famous for this theory. The press is significantly more than a purveyor of information and opinion. It may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. So it's really about which issues can you put on the agenda. And as you see, this quote comes from 1963. It has been investigated a lot. If you would do a simple search online, this is perhaps one of the most researched topics in the field of communication science. The question then is there still something to discover? And that's also what, for example, two famous professors have asked in 2008. They said, the agenda setting paradigm reflects the capacities of ideas to motor on, unimpeded by inconvenient realities to the contrary. They actually said, well, with all those media and the fragmented media landscape of today, maybe there is not so much agenda setting going on anymore. I hope to challenge that idea in the current paper, and also stating that yes, agenda setting, it's a classical theory, but there's still much more to discover about it. First, I hope to connect different types of agenda setting within this single study. So we're looking at agenda setting on the public agenda, but also the intermedia agenda and political agenda setting. This study shows that agenda setting is something that happens on the individual level, so something that happens in people's own mind, but also on the aggregate level. That's normally how agenda setting is being studied. And then finally, it hopes to show that political or agenda setting in general is something that we normally test with regular media, but perhaps this can also occur with alternative news media, focusing on political satire specifically, which is one of the genres that my core interest is in. So if you talk about agenda setting, it's normally the idea that you have multiple agendas, a political agenda, which is normally said, well, this is what's going on in the real world, a media agenda, what are the media reporting about, and a public agenda. And the idea is that all of them can influence each other. The political agenda can be influenced, of course, by the public. What the public think is important can then result in something being picked up by politicians, ideally in a representative democracy. But citizens can also respond to what they see politicians are talking about. Something that most communication scientists are interested in, well, what is the effects that media can have on the political agenda, or most often studied is the public agenda. What is frequently covered by the media, is that also what citizens think is the important topic for society today. So this is normally how agenda setting is being studied. The current study actually checks, well, within all those three different agendas, is there perhaps an alternative media that can also have an effect on this? And we specifically look at the satire program Zondag met Lubach, which is a Dutch satire show comparable or very comparable to Last Week Tonight of John Oliver. Then you have an idea what kind of program this is. So, like I said, the study is being conducted in the Netherlands, where I'm from. It investigates the show Zondag met Lubach, which is similar to John Oliver, and we do this in the time setting of 2015. Because in that year, Zondag met Lubach aired an episode about, and especially focused on TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the United States and the European Union. This was a topic rather unfamiliar at that time, at least in the Netherlands, whereas in Germany people were already protesting against it. In the Netherlands, not many people knew about it at all. Also, it was not frequently covered, and politicians were not really engaged with the topic either. And we hope to show that these things have been put on the different agendas after this satire show dedicated its episode on it. So this is just a screenshot from that episode. What it did, it was really talking the audience through the different policies related to TTIP. And by means of that, we think it can relate to different steps that are necessary for agenda setting to take place. If we look at existing research on agenda setting, it normally only looks at the final outcome. Do people think a certain topic is important, or do they not really care much about it? But what we argue in the paper is that for agenda setting to occur, there are two steps necessary before people can actually evaluate the topic to be important. Before you can think something is important, of course, you need to know about this issue. So the first step that we need to investigate, did the satire show increase the knowledge about this topic among the audience? Then people only can care about a certain issue if they feel they understand it. If you feel something is very vague, very abstract, you most of the time don't care much about it. So you need to understand what is going on, and only then you can evaluate or act. Act in a way that you think the topic is important. And like I said, that's what most of the existing studies focus on in relation to regular media coverage. But we take all these three different steps into account in the current study. So looking at step 1, there's already a lot of research showing that political satire can contribute to knowledge about political issues. And that's not only easy knowledge, like who is this politician, or where did US go to war, because most, like I would say 99% of all the studies on political satire come from the US context. But there are also some studies show that it can actually contribute knowledge to complicated topics, for example, campaign financing. So we expect for the first hypothesis that yes, exposure to political satire about this topic can positively affect knowledge about the topic. We tested this using a panel survey. A panel survey means that people are repeatedly asked similar questions. The same people are answering similar questions over time. So you can actually see how people develop over time. And we were very lucky that we were already fielding this survey, and that exactly between wave 1 and wave 2 of the survey, this episode aired. So in the second wave, we could ask people about, do you actually know what is TTIP? So in wave 1, we measured existing features of people, their demographics, but also their media exposure, including asking them, do you watch Zondag met Lubach, the satire show that we're interested in? And we measured more general, how much knowledge do people have about politics? So we can use that as a control variable, saying that it's not just the more knowledgeable people that pick up knowledge about TTIP, but actually on top of that, media exposure to this specific program has an effect. So we had in the second wave a multiple choice question asking people, do you know what is TTIP? And about 60% of the people then answered it correctly. If we look at the exact statistical results, you can see here that overall, Zondag met Lubach had an effect. If you see here in the top right corner, yes, it had a significant effect, and this effect was one of the most strong effects that we find of all the different control variables and independent variables compared. So exposure to regular satire did not have an effect. This basically means that no, it's not just people's characteristic of being interested in satire that predicts this knowledge, but it's really the exposure to this specific satire show that increases the knowledge. And for example, exposure to regular news, mainstream news, also has a positive effect, but much weaker. How does this concretely look like? Here we have a graph showing this effect, and it shows that yes, the more people consume this satire show, the more regularly they consume it in an average month, the more likely they are to answer this question correctly, even increasing from 60% to 85%, which basically means with a factor of 31%, it becomes more likely to answer this question correctly. So yes, satire can increase knowledge about TTIP. The next question is, can it also increase people's understanding? Do they feel they understand this topic better or not? And you might say, well, this is kind of unlikely because this satire is just funny. But what we see in recent forms of satire is that it's not just funny anymore, but they do significant amounts of research and they provide the audience with considerable amounts of information, perhaps even more than many of the regular news shows. Because news shows, they jump from one issue to the next issue, and often it's about what one politician is saying and how the other politician is responding, but it doesn't really dive into the topic, in the policies that are involved. And that's actually what satire does. They really dig out a certain issue, and they do this in much longer segments than you would normally see in regular news coverage. And also, so this is content-wise, but also in terms of media psychology, what do people do with the content? We know that to understand jokes and to understand satire, this demands a lot of cognitive resources from people. People need to really pay attention to a satire show to understand what is going on. This requires central processing. If you don't pay enough attention, you will not get the joke. So if people pay more attention, they will probably also better understand what is going on than if they pay perhaps less attention, which they might do when they consume regular forms of news. So the second hypothesis that we have is that political satire about TTIP positively affects people's feeling of being informed about this topic. Step 3. After people have the knowledge, then feel they understand it, then the idea is that, well, then it's possible for them to find this topic important as well. And we know from research on agenda setting that, yes, people follow media if they pay attention to a certain topic. They follow with, okay, then we think this is important as well. The question is, of course, can this also occur with funny kinds of genres? And this seems less likely, because if they are just funny, why should I think a topic is important? However, what we see is that many of the satire shows today are not just funny. There's something else going on. But going this step back, yes, we know from research, and this is a paper written by myself in 2015, shows that on the moment people think something is more funny, they're also more likely to counter-argue it. They don't take the arguments so serious. And this also means that on the moment that a satire is not just funny anymore, but also can be considered serious, then actually it might have these kind of effects on opinions, but also on agenda setting. And that is what we see these days, that satire is not just funny anymore, but it becomes serious and it becomes earnest. Clear example is John Oliver, of course, but also Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. It's clearly, it's funny, it's satire, obviously, but on the other hand, she is showing that she really cares what she is talking about. It's not just funny to her, but she can get angry about it. And that's the same thing happening in Zondag met Lubach. Yes, he's funny, people have to laugh a lot about the program, but on the same moment, it's clear that he means it. He is serious about the topic and he seriously did his research, or his team. But it's not just only a laughing matter, it's something much more than that. So we expect that indirectly, the public agenda might be affected through political satire, engaging some kind of feeling of being informed, and this can then lead to people feeling a topic is more important. How did we study this? Well, it's twofold. So first we did an experiment, and this experiment also included this concept of feeling something is important. We call this subjective information. It's a concept developed by Weinman in 2013. And in this experiment, together with Joyce Schouten, who did this for her master thesis, we asked people questions like, well, I felt informed by the video. I understood the crucial facts of the video. I learned something. So really the idea that this video has contributed something to your knowledge. And what we see is that if we compare, because this is an experiment, people are randomly exposed to either a regular news program, to this satire show, or to a documentary about TTIP, we clearly see that on top of the knowledge that's being provided by regular journalistic kind of programs, it's a satire show that even more can contribute to this feeling of being informed about it. The content was rather similar, so these were items shown from the news program or for the documentary or from the satire show dealing with a similar topic, rather comparable. But people after watching the satire show felt more informed than those who didn't watch the satire show but saw the regular forms of journalism. So we know that satire compared to news and compared to the documentary leads to a stronger feeling of being informed about TTIP. And what we then tested was, well, we also measured some indicators of public agenda setting. So people who felt more informed also felt that this topic was more important. They said, well, just on a scale from 1 to 10, this important is relatively more important. People were more likely to talk about this topic with their friends, their families, or their colleagues. And also they were more likely to intend to participate in certain actions regarding this issue. For example, sharing information on social media, signing a petition, or even participating in a demonstration. This all became more likely after watching the satire program compared to the regular forms of journalism in news or in documentary. So, like I said, we studied this in two ways. This was the individual level. We asked people themselves to indicate how important they felt it was, how much they felt informed by it. But it's important to realize that agenda setting is a concept that, yes, we can evaluate and study on the individual level, but you want to ideally see, did something change as well on the aggregate level? Do we see changes in the overall society? And we want to test with that whether TTIP could really determine the agenda, what was going on in the Netherlands at that time. And normally agenda setting is being tested with survey questions. People are asked the question, which topic do you think is most important in the country at this moment? But it's something that is very hard to deal with because people will always raise the same topics, unemployment, immigration. So we cannot really see whether one topic became more important over time. And also, it's hard to trace this over time because they need to ask the same questions, the same people, this question every week, for example. And that's just very costly, very expensive for researchers. So what is a recent development is that we do not only look at this kind of survey questions, but we can actually look at people's search behavior online. If people Google on a certain topic, this probably means they think it's important because people could Google for any kind of topic. It's their scarce resource time. If they Google on a certain topic, they probably think it's worth their time to investigate more in this. So this is an indicator that this is important. And some studies, for example, these two which are on the slide, have shown that there are indeed correlations between this item asking how important is this topic or which topic do you think is the biggest problem in the society and online search query data. So there's a strong correlation with that. And we can use this. We can now test and gather data from Google. How often did people search for TTIP as an indicator of this public agenda? And then the expectation, of course, is that after this episode, satire episode about TTIP, people are more likely to Google for it. So this is public agenda setting. If we then look at intermedia agenda setting, this is more complicated for several reasons. First of all, journalists have indicated that they feel troubled by this rise of satirists. Satirists are more or less taking their place. People take satirists serious who don't adhere to the same journalistic standards as journalists would do. So that's one. They feel their place is being taken. But secondly, satirists are often very critical about news media and also in their format. They are a parody of news media. So the journalists might feel a little bit offended by them. Third, journalists only want to cover things which are serious and not per se entertainment. And for them, it's very hard and a struggle to determine, well, what those satirists are talking about. Is it something serious? Is it sincere? Or is it just purely entertainment? And then lastly, it's related to that first point, journalists have said that satirists are more or less unwelcome visitors on their terrain. They are taking their place. So if they experience that, would they be likely to cover the things that are going on in a satire show? That's the question we hope to answer. But based on some existing research, for example, from the US elections, I guess that was 2012, in which Sarah Palin was very much parodized by Saturday Night Live. And journalistic organizations took over that frame that was being placed in the parody. So that's already a sign. Well, journalists actually look at what's happening in satire and take this into account when developing their coverage. Also, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart has put certain issues clearly on the American news agenda, also the political agenda, obviously. And this, for example, was an action he took for emergency responders who helped during 9/11, got sick afterwards, but were not really helped in terms of their healthcare. He proposed a bill to help these people, and that was eventually covered a lot in the media and actually was taken and signed as a real law in the United States context. So we expect that TTIP also becomes a more prominent topic in the news media after the satire broadcast on this topic. And then finally, and perhaps most interesting, is whether the political agenda can be affected by the satire program. And there are some assumptions why this might be the case. First of all, satirists often directly address those people in power. They really directly say, well, what they should be doing or why they're doing stupid things. So satirists might feel attacked by, politicians might feel attacked by this, but also spoken to, so they might respond as well then. From studies, we know that politicians take satire actually rather serious and they perceive it as being influential. That's why they visit these programs if they have a chance. They also think there's a third person effect going on. So although I'm a politician, I might not be affected, but the general audience is affected. So I should already, play into this and actually take into account what the audience thinks of this program. And finally, we know from general political agenda research is that on the topic there is a clear political responsibility, which of course is the case for a trade agreement, a topic that is unfamiliar, which is also the case. Many politicians were not so familiar with this topic as TTIP, and when the coverage is negative, politicians are most likely to respond. And the coverage was very negative because the satire host was very critical about this agreement, because it would mean that the European Union had to take over the standards that are existing in the United States in terms of, for example, food safety, which in the US are simply much lower than in Europe. So the hypothesis that we test there is that TTIP becomes more frequently a topic of discussion in Parliament after the satire episode on this topic was being broadcasted. We study this with time series data, more complicated, we could say ARIMA modeling. It basically means that we have data over time, so we can see certain trends happening. And can actually detect, well, those trends that we see and maybe certain spikes in attentions, are those related to those specific news episodes. And we look at the moment that the first negotiations about TTIP started until about half a year after a second episode was featured in the satire show about this. So for the public, we used Google Trends data, seeing how often people search for this particular topic. For the media, we looked at news coverage of this topic. How often was this covered every week in the newspapers as well as in the biggest national newswire? And for politics, we looked at a number of questions asked in Parliament by politicians about TTIP per week. What did we see? So this is how you would visualize it. And you can clearly see there's actually already 3 spikes. So in attention, here one, and here's also one. And for 2 of those, we can clearly predict that those are the outcome of the Satire show. This is the moment the arrow points at, is when the Satire broadcast aired. And you immediately see after that a clear peak in terms of public attention. The people started Googling more on it. A little bit later, also the media started to pay attention. And here we actually see that those things almost directly co-occurred. So on the moment the Satire episode broadcast, there's a first peak in attention, and the audience even started to search more, perhaps 1 week later. For this third peak, we don't really have a clear explanation. Is there anything happening with the political agenda? Might be, but that's not clear. That's why we need to look at the statistics to see whether actually those trends are significant. If we look at the public agenda, there's 2 interesting things to note. So first of all, what we know from regular agenda setting research, that people respond to the normal media agenda. On the moment that there was more coverage about TTIP in newspapers or on television, people were more likely to Google for this. So the regular news media have an effect. The political agenda doesn't have an effect. So people really respond to the news media, but not to the political agenda. But where we find the strongest effect is after the ZML Zondag met Lubach episode aired. A very strong effect, but this effect is decaying. So this means that people paid a lot of attention after this episode, but it also went down again. There's only a marginally significant effect on the long term. So yes, people were more likely to Google on this topic after the first episode, but his attention also went down rather fast. If we then look at the effects on the media agenda and the political agenda, we also find interesting things. So first, looking at intermedia agenda setting, we don't find a direct effect of the Satire episode on more media coverage. So it seems like journalists indeed don't immediately respond to what is going on in the Satire show. But what is interesting is that they respond to the public agenda. So on the moment that the public thinks this is a more important topic, journalists are also more likely to cover it. And this can be twofold. But at least it means that the effect of a Satire show could be indirectly translated through the public agenda on the media agenda. It could be for one reason. Journalists are looking at what the public thinks is interesting and cover this kind of news. It could also be that journalists simply are part of the public. They are also normal citizens. They need to process this news and 1 week later can respond to it. So the effect at least is delayed. There's a delayed effect of the Satire show through the public agenda on the media agenda. And then the most stunning finding of the study is that yes, the political agenda was also affected by the political satire show. On average, every week after the first episode about TTIP in the satire show, politicians asked about half a question extra in Parliament, which might not seem a lot, but actually there are not so many questions being asked in Parliament every week. And this would still mean that twice per month, politicians were likely to raise this topic and ask questions about it, which was not the case in the weeks, months, and years before the satire episode was aired. So I hope that this presentation gives you the idea that satire can matter. And the study, and especially the paper, also shows that we sometimes need to have different building blocks to test our theories and to test our assumptions about what effects there might exist. Because I think in the study, or in the paper, there are 3 different studies and all have their weakness. But together they build a strong argument and a strong evidence to show, yes, this effect exists. It also shows that agenda setting still exists. Agenda setting is still as relevant as it has been before. But it's not only about the news media. The satire genre also has an effect. And we should not only look at the effects that exist of media on citizens, but also the media might respond to the satire show, and politicians even do so directly. A limitation, of course, of the current study is that, well, we test this for one topic and one satire episode. The question is, well, will this happen every week? Probably not. It only happens with certain topics that are covered in such a convincing way, topics that the audience actually cares about, and it also matters what kind of satire show you're looking at. I think the shows like Zondag met Lubach, Last Week Tonight are especially effective for this because they provide this combination of humor and seriousness. Also, a strong argument for why this would occur in this particular setting is that the Netherlands is rather unpolarized. We have many different political parties, which doesn't make that people, as in the US, feel like they're in one group or the other group. No, people can be in both groups. And the satire show is also not clearly liberal or conservative. It attacks all the different parties, so people take it as a more neutral source. And what we then in a follow-up study investigated, that's the one that you see on top, it will be published somewhere in October probably, is that yes, these agenda setting effects might exist, but they will not exist for all topics. And we looked here at a fiction series about politics, which is called Borgen, in the Danish context. And actually show, yes, there are some episodes which have agenda setting effects, but most of the time not. And that's probably also the case for satire shows. They might have these agenda setting effects, but this will definitely not happen all the time. And I want to close this presentation with a final quote, providing more evidence that political satire really had this effect on the political agenda that you might find perhaps hard to believe. But the minister at that time, the Minister of Foreign Trade and Development, actually said this in an interview with a newspaper. I've been trying to attract attention for TTIP a long time. I wrote an opinion article, but no newspaper was interested in it. When Lubach, that is a satire host, paid attention, suddenly there was a debate and questions were raised in Parliament. So I hope with this you got a clear overview of what satire might accomplish in the current media landscape and political landscape. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And otherwise, I wish you all the best. Bye bye.